22-year-old University of Tennessee medical student, Ellie Claire Young, was attending the Making Strides Against Breast Cancer charity walk in Memphis in October of 2024 when someone in a CRV pulled up next to her Jeep and shot her twice in broad daylight. The close-range execution occurred in the visitor center parking lot at Shelby Farms Park, where the gravely injured young woman could be seen exiting her car. Later identified as the victim's ex-boyfriend, 26-year-old Jackson Hopper, the gunman fired at least one more shot at Young before fleeing the scene. Young collapsed onto the pavement and died at the scene, and an hours-long multi-agency pursuit ensued as law enforcement chased the fleeing assassin across county lines. At one point, the suspect attempted to hit a Tipton County constable as he laid stop sticks across the road. The chase continued into Dyer County, where a deputy disabled Hopper's vehicle using a pit maneuver as the suspect drove into oncoming traffic. Even after flipping his car, Hopper remained determined to evade capture and fought with deputies as they took him into custody. He's facing a first-degree murder charge, as well as felony evading, aggravated assault without injury, reckless endangerment, reckless driving, resisting arrest, speeding, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a dangerous felony. Number 17. Ariana Gibbs. Tea time with a friend nearly turned into tragedy for a Florida priest in October of 2024 when he was attacked by a knife-wielding woman on a bicycle. Father Matt Marino of Trinity Parish was sitting outside Juniper Market in St. Augustine at around 8 a.m. when 22-year-old Ariana Gibbs approached him and said, "Excuse me, sir," in a completely unprovoked fashion. The suspect stabbed Marino. The priest and his friend attempted to fight off the attacker, who eventually got back on her bike and pedaled away. Marino suffered a punctured lung, and police soon caught up with Gibbs, who was arrested on suspicion of attempted second-degree homicide, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and felony simple assault. As news about the incident began to circulate, it was revealed that Gibbs had been involved in a separate incident with a McDonald's worker just minutes before she attacked Marino. According to reports, she approached an employee at the restaurant and asked if they could help her with something while grabbing their arm. She showed them a knife, but the victim yanked their arm back and no one was harmed. Gibbs has a previous misdemeanor battery case from the month before her most recent arrest. She and Marino do not appear to have any prior connections, indicating that the attack was random for the time being. She remains held without bond at the St. Johns County Jail. Number 16. George Mandarakis. Before he became an accused stalker, 36-year-old George Mandarakis was a high-ranking official at Notre Dame University in Indiana. In 2019, he began dating a female student while pretending to be a single student, close to her age when in reality, he was married and a decade older than her. The relationship lasted for 4.5 years before the woman, who's now 27 years old, broke up with Mandarakis in October of 2023 due to his lies. That very same day, Mandarakis drove from New Jersey to Trenton, Michigan, where his ex was living at the time. After finally agreeing to meet up with him amid his incessant phone calls, the woman reiterated her desire to cut ties with Mandarakis, who reportedly tried to stop her from leaving. She got away, but Mandarakis returned to Trenton less than 2 months later and confronted the woman outside a salon. The two had had no contact since Mandarakis' last visit, leaving his ex confused about how he knew where she was. She later told investigators that Mandarakis tried to hug, kiss, propose marriage, and stop her from leaving. The woman managed to drive away but was graced with Mandarakis' unwelcome presence yet again later that day when he showed up at a bar where she was spending time with her friends. Later on, she received text messages from Mandarakis stating that he wouldn't stop until they got back together. He proceeded to send her unwanted gifts in the mail, including a package that was sent from nearby, indicating that he was in the area. In late December of 2023, a concerned friend of Mandarakis contacted the woman with his suspicions that Mandarakis was going to kidnap or harm her in some way. Mandarakis had told the friend that he had listened to a podcast about a man who got his ex-girlfriend back by kidnapping her and taking her to Mexico. Shortly thereafter, the woman found a GPS tracking device taped under her bumper. She left the device on and drove to a church where, sure enough, Mandarakis showed up a short while later. Aware of the situation, police stopped him and arrested him for stalking. Inside the car, they found $12,000 cash, multiple cell phones, ads featuring sailboats for sale, and maps for sailing from Florida to Cuba and from New Jersey to Morocco. Officers also found a so-called kidnapping kit containing a gun, ammunition, handcuffs, rope, a knife, a stun gun, and more. Mandarakis was charged in federal court with attempted kidnapping, which can carry a prison sentence of up to 20 years. Records show that he's currently in custody with an unknown release date, indicating that the case is likely ongoing. Number 15. Deandra Ford. 20-year-old single mother Deandra Ford was last seen leaving the Houston Adult Bar where she worked at 1 o'clock in the morning in late September of 2023. Knowing she would never willingly abandon her young son, her family reported her missing the next day after being unable to reach her. Surveillance evidence showed Ford getting into a white Ford Transit van with an unidentified man outside her workplace. At the same time, she had been text messaging with her boyfriend, who she told not to pick her up because she had found a ride. At the time of her disappearance, Ford was the main witness in a capital murder case in which a man she was riding in a vehicle with was shot and killed. There was evidence of the suspects talking to one another about how Ford wasn't safe in the area, leading to fears that someone may have gone to whatever lengths they felt were necessary in order to silence her. Ford was still missing in January of 2024 when authorities announced the arrest of 51-year-old Yolande J. Washington for murder. Although the young woman's body had not yet been found, investigators believed she was dead, and they're claiming that Washington had offered to pay her $200 for intimacy shortly before her disappearance. Washington told police that he dropped Ford off at a location away from her workplace, but a search of his van turned up a large amount of blood evidence containing her DNA. The suspect has a long history of violence against women, and the account of events that he gave to detectives reportedly conflicts with the story told by the evidence. Roughly 6 months after Ford went missing, her body was found in a culvert in Dallas, roughly a 3.5-hour drive away from Houston. It's also where Washington was apprehended, further pointing toward his possible involvement in the crime. It remains unclear whether the homicide is related to Ford's status as a capital murder witness. Number 14. Katie Higton and Stephen Harnett. Just weeks after his girlfriend broke up with him in May of 2023, 34-year-old Marcus Osborne discovered that his ex, 27-year-old Katie Higton of West Yorkshire, England, was dating a new man. The mother of four had tried to keep the new relationship with 25-year-old Stephen Harnett a secret from Osborne, whom she had ended things with due to his controlling and abusive ways. But he hacked into her Snapchat and saw a photo of the couple together. One night while they were out at the movies, Osborne broke into Higton's home in Huddersfield, where he laid in wait for her to return. As soon as she walked in the door, he stabbed her to death, inflicting nearly 100 wounds to her body. He then took another woman captive at the house and used Higton's phone to text message Harnett and lure him to the property. In what was later described by authorities as a sadistic knife attack, Osborne stabbed Harnett at least 24 times. After moving the bodies of Higton and Harnett next to one another, Osborne spent the next several hours in the house. He assaulted his surviving captive, invited a neighbor over to see the dead bodies, then fled the scene. Osborne later turned himself into the police and was charged accordingly for his crimes. The accused double murderer already had a violent history, which included 2 prior convictions for abuse against former partners in 2011 and 2012. Just 4 days before her death, Higton had told police that Osborne had threatened to kill her if she got another boyfriend. She was afraid her ex would seriously harm or kill her, and her prediction was tragically correct. 2 months after the killings, Osborne pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. He was handed a whole life order, which means he'll remain behind bars until his dying day. Number 13. Rasheem Carter. 25-year-old Rasheem Carter was last seen at a motel in Laurel, Mississippi in October of 2022. The day prior, he had complained to the Taylorsville police that several men were after him. On the day he vanished, he called his mother Tiffany in a panic, claiming that several white men were chasing after him in 3 trucks while hurling racial slurs. According to Tiffany, Carter had fled a job site where he was working as a welder. After getting into a disagreement with a co-worker, it was the last the family ever heard from him. Roughly 2 weeks later, a landowner gave police a photo of Carter that had been captured by a motion-activated trail camera. Tiffany believes that her son is running for his life in the image, which offers no clues about who he might have been fleeing from. Carter's whereabouts remained a mystery until about a month after he vanished, when his skeletal remains were found scattered over a several-acre area. His head was separated from his body, leading his family to suspect that he had met an especially brutal end. And while Carter's clothing and several of his belongings were recovered, his phone was never found. The Smith County Sheriff's Office initially said that there was no reason to suspect foul play, and reportedly said that Carter's remains may have been torn apart by animals An autopsy was inconclusive, but Tiffany remains certain that her son was in danger when she last spoke with him. She said that Carter was lucid during the conversation and that he showed no signs of being under the influence of drugs or alcohol. More than 2 years later, Carter's mysterious death remains under investigation by the FBI and the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation, but it doesn't appear any closer to being solved, and the family's fight for answers continues. Number 12. Larry and Connie Van Oosten. In February of 2017, Larry and Connie Van Oosten awoke to the presence of a masked man standing over their bed at their Erie, Illinois home. The intruder, who was using a device to disguise his voice, handcuffed the couple and placed duct tape over their eyes, then forced them into the trunk of a Chevy Caprice. He drove for about a half hour before leading his captives into a house where he ordered them into a windowless basement through a hidden trapdoor. Inside the secret space, there was a mattress on the floor, a DVD collection, and a supply of snacks. The kidnapper removed Connie and Larry's handcuffs and locked them into the room for the night. The next morning, he ordered Connie out of the basement and drove to a bank where he instructed her to withdraw a check for $350,000 from her bank account. Before sending her inside, the man reminded her that he worked for a professional kidnapping ring. He also told Connie that he was planning to keep her and Larry alive for 2 weeks before murdering them both. After entering the building, Connie wrote the teller a note explaining that she was being held at gunpoint. In it, she warned the teller not to react to what she was reading. She was too scared to wait for help to arrive, so she requested the $350,000 check and left with her captor. Connie had the teller make the check out to a business named Store Edge, which FBI agents soon traced to a 42-year-old man named Chad Shipper. He attended the same church as the Van Oostens and was a former financial advisor who had failed to recover from some bad investments, leaving him broke and desperate. Given his familiarity with the Van Oostens, it's believed that he targeted them because he knew they were financially successful. Early the next morning, officers stationed near the Van Oostens' home spotted Shipper's Caprice. They attempted to pull him over, but he fled, leading them on a high-speed chase which lasted for 20 minutes before he lost control of his car and struck a guardrail. Inside the car, police found plastic sheeting, a gun, duct tape, a shovel, and gloves, indicating that the suspect planned to kill the Van Oostens in the near future. Shipper immediately confessed to the abduction and led law enforcement to the house where he was keeping the couple. He pleaded guilty to aggravated kidnapping with a concealed identity, home invasion with a dangerous weapon, and theft, and is currently serving a 60-year prison sentence. Number 11. Elizabeth Ricks Sullivan. In October of 2014, 32-year-old mother of two, Elizabeth Liz Ricks Sullivan, called a friend in a panic from her San Diego home. She was arguing with her husband, Matthew Scott Sullivan, and she was saying that Matthew was going to kill her. The call abruptly ended and nobody ever heard from Liz again. Investigators soon learned that the missing woman was having an affair with a man she had met on Tinder named Stephen Sutton. Matthew claimed this didn't bother him. By the time he found out, he and Liz were pretty much living separate lives anyway, despite remaining under the same roof. Yet, Matthew had taunted Sutton over text messages in the weeks leading up to Liz's disappearance, indicating that he was more bothered by the affair than he was willing to admit. It was also discovered that Liz had visited a divorce attorney the day she went missing, but detectives couldn't find any truly incriminating evidence against either of the men in Liz's life, leading them to wonder if perhaps she had vanished on her own accord and started a new life. A breakthrough in the case finally came in October 2016, nearly 2 years after Liz was last seen alive, when her body washed ashore along a San Diego bay. She had been beaten and stabbed to death. Based on the condition of Liz's remains, investigators determined that she had either died within the last month or had somehow been preserved. Her body had turned up the very same day Matthew and his new girlfriend moved out of the home he and Liz had once shared, leading to the suspicion that Liz's body had been kept in a freezer until Matthew more or less had to get rid of it. A luminol test revealed large amounts of blood throughout the home, which could only have gotten there by way of a violent act. In January of 2018, Matthew was charged with Liz's murder. He denied any wrongdoing but was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 16 years in prison. Number 10. Sky Lemons Dixon. 41-year-old Houston Ketter III of Albany, New York, has an alarming history of violence against women. In November of 2022, he doused a young mother named Carrie Rouse in lighter fluid and set her ablaze. Rouse awoke from a coma in the hospital 2 months later, unable to speak and covered in excruciating burns. Another woman, 23-year-old Sky Lemons Dixon, accused Ketter of torturing her over a 4-month period. Ketter broke the woman's arm, burned her with a pot, asked her how she wanted to die, and tried setting her on fire. As Ketter's trial for charges involving both women approached in late 2023, Lemons Dixon told prosecutors that she was extremely afraid that she would end up paying with her life for testifying against him. She vanished in October, right around the same time her order of protection against Ketter expired, and she was still missing when the defendant's case went to trial 2 weeks later. Ketter was in custody at the time, but the judge ruled that he likely had something to do with her disappearance. During a jailhouse phone call, he had asked someone to Google what happens if a witness fails to show up for trial. The judge ruled that the trial would proceed using Lemons Dixon's grand jury testimony from earlier on in the case, and Rouse also testified. The jury found Ketter guilty of attempted murder and felony assault. 2 months later, he received the maximum sentence of 50 years to life. 6 days after that, on Christmas Day, Lemons Dixon was found clinging to life in her apartment with a gunshot wound. She was rushed to the hospital where she succumbed to her injuries on New Year's Day. Authorities have released few details about the murder, but 2 out of 3 defendants have been convicted in connection with the case. In September, Ibrahim Hammond pleaded guilty to perjury, and Michael Varlock pleaded guilty to criminal possession of a weapon. A third suspect, Patrick Dean, is facing charges of first-degree murder, possession of a weapon, and tampering with evidence. The nature of Hammond and Varlock's roles in the crime have not been specified, and it remains unclear whether Ketter was involved in Lemons Dixon's murder. Number 9. Mary Rose Feely. 27-year-old Mary Rose Feely was a well-known anti-drug activist in and around Somerville, New Jersey, where she became somewhat of a local celebrity for her dedication to the opioid recovery movement. She was inspired to get involved during her brother's recovery, but her voice went quiet in January of 2024 when she was murdered outside her home. Feely was found unresponsive on the ground shortly before 10:30 p.m. by a family member. Her car door was open and her belongings were scattered in the yard. She had been stabbed at least 37 times. Emergency responders immediately undertook life-saving efforts, but the young woman succumbed to her injuries and was pronounced dead at the scene. Several days later, police responded to a report about a suspicious person washing a car, which was doused in bleach. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, officers also found a black gaiter which resembled the attire worn by the murder suspect in surveillance footage of the crime. Police arrested the car's owner, 27-year-old David C. Schroitman, on suspicion of first-degree murder, hindering apprehension or prosecution, stalking, and 2 weapon charges. During a search of his house, investigators found more evidence linking the suspect to the crime, including a manifesto containing a step-by-step plan for committing a homicide. According to authorities, Feely and Schroitman went to the same high school and graduated in the same class nearly a decade earlier, but there was no evidence whatsoever that they were ever in a romantic relationship. Schroitman pleaded not guilty to the charges and remains held without bail. Number 8. Dylan Rounds. When 19-year-old Dylan Rounds fell out of touch with his family on Memorial Day in 2022, it didn't take long for them to start suspecting foul play. He was last seen at a bar in Montello, Nevada, roughly 30 miles from his home in Lucin, Utah. Around the same time, all his phone and banking activity stopped. Rounds had recently purchased the remote property with plans to turn it into a farm, and was actively working toward his goal when he vanished. During a search of the area, police found his boots and truck roughly 5 miles from the camp he lived in, but they turned up no signs of Rounds himself, and the effort was called off after several days. Knowing the teen wouldn't abandon his homestead, his family stood by their belief that someone had harmed him. They were further convinced of this after noticing that all his belongings were accounted for at his property. About a month after Rounds was last seen, authorities identified his neighbor, 59-year-old James Brenner, as a suspect in the case. Brenner was squatting on an adjacent property and was known to interact with Rounds. In March of 2023, prosecutors charged Brenner with the missing man's murder. The suspect's DNA was reportedly found on Rounds' boots, and cell phone location data placed the young man's last known location on the property where Brenner was squatting. His phone was found in a pond and contained a video showing Brenner cleaning a gun with blood on his shirt. The footage was from right around the time Rounds went missing. Police were able to retrieve the bloody shirt Brenner was wearing in the clip, which tests positive for Rounds' DNA. In April 2024, Brenner led police to Rounds' remains as part of a plea agreement. The findings revealed that he had been shot in the head. Rounds' mother, Candice Cooley, told news outlet KSL that Brenner committed the homicide because he was upset about where Rounds had parked his truck that day. In exchange for providing the location of the remains, Brenner pleaded guilty to a reduced second-degree murder charge and 2 other counts. He was sentenced to 3 to 30 years in prison. Number 7. Jaden Anthony. 18-year-old mother of 1 Jaden Anthony was working the overnight shift at a 7-Eleven store in Oklahoma City in October 2024 when a young man attacked her at 2:45 in the morning. Surveillance footage shows the suspect approaching the register and having what appeared to be a normal conversation with Anthony as he pulled out his wallet and the young woman scanned his purchase. According to police, the suspect suddenly pulled a knife and demanded money from the till. Anthony complied, but the thief stabbed her anyway and fled the scene on foot. Nearly an hour later, another customer entered the store and found the young woman dead. 4 days after the incident, police announced that they had arrested a 23-year-old suspect named Anthony Gonzalez on suspicion of robbery and first-degree murder. He remains in custody at the Oklahoma County Detention Center amid the ongoing case. Number 6. Molly Miller and Colt Haynes. 17-year-old Molly Miller and 21-year-old Colt Haynes were riding in a car driven by their friend, 22-year-old James Con Nip, in July of 2013 when an officer tried to pull them over in Wilson, Oklahoma. Instead of cooperating with the traffic stop, Nip stepped on the gas and led law enforcement on a multi-county chase. He eventually lost control of the vehicle along a dirt road and crashed in a wooded area near his family's sprawling 1,000-acre property in Love County. The accident occurred at around 9 p.m. By then, the police chase had been called off by Nip's uncle, Love County Sheriff Marion Joe Russell. Miller and Haynes began trying to call their friends later that night, saying that they were lost in the wilderness and needed help finding their way out. At one point, the pair told friends that Haynes had fallen while climbing a tree in an attempt to get an overhead view of any nearby roads. They said that he had broken his ankle and that the bone was sticking out, which meant that he wouldn't be exiting the woods on foot. Miller and Haynes went radio silent before 10 a.m. the next morning and were never seen or heard from again. In the meantime, Nip made it back home and insisted he had no knowledge of his missing friend's whereabouts. It's a claim he stands by to this day, leaving investigators unsure of exactly what transpired that night. Nip was convicted of fleeing from law enforcement and served 4 years in prison. He was still unwilling to talk about the disappearance of Miller and Haynes after his release, leaving the case at a standstill that persists to this day. Some people believe the missing friend succumbed to the elements, while many suspect that Nip and his relatives know more than they're letting on. The case is being overseen by the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Anyone with information is urged to come forward and share what they know as the families continue the seemingly endless wait for answers. Number 5. Talon Lowry. 18-year-old gas station employee Brian Ramirez was outside his workplace in North Hall, Georgia one evening in November of 2017 when a man pulled up behind him in a pickup truck and shot him in the back with a rifle. The shooter, 19-year-old Talon Lowry, recorded the murder with his phone and posted the footage to Snapchat. Lowry sped off in his truck and Ramirez was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators soon tracked Lowry down through the Snapchat video and charged him with malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a crime. The two teens had no previous connections, according to prosecutors who accused Lowry of killing Ramirez for attention on social media. Lowry pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming that his schizophrenia was to blame for his actions. In early 2023, a jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 25 years and is required to undergo mental health treatment during his time in prison. Number 4. Lee Ann Sabine. On numerous occasions over an 18-year period, Lee Ann Sabine joked with friends about how she had killed her late husband, John. Nobody thought she was serious until John's mummified remains were found in a shed on Sabine's property in the Welsh village of Bordeaux following her death in 2015. John was 67 years old when he was last seen in 1997. Wrapped in 40 layers of plastic, his body was so well preserved that the medical examiner was able to identify the cause of death as blunt force trauma. Lee had bludgeoned him with a lawn ornament, later telling her friends that he was abusive and had abandoned her for other women. When she began joking about killing John, people assumed there was no way she was being serious, which had the paradoxical effect of helping her keep her secret until after she passed away from cancer at the age of 74. Two of Lee's friends realized that it was no joke about a month after her death when they unwrapped what they thought was a medical skeleton that she had used as a prop to carry on a prank about being John's killer. An inquest later found that Lee and John had moved to New Zealand in the 60s, then back to Britain in the 80s, leaving their 5 children behind. After the discovery of his father's body, the couple's son, Steve, didn't seem one bit surprised about his mother's actions. He hadn't spoken to his parents in decades, but remembered Lee as an evil woman who only cared about herself. The case was recently featured in the documentary The Body Next Door, which explores how Lee's eccentric and attention-seeking personality traits made her capable of committing the crime. Number 3. Joseph Brinson. 28-year-old Joseph Brinson vanished from his home in Jefferson County, Colorado, in January of 2019. His car was found parked outside his residence, but there was no trace of him in sight. A neighbor reported seeing strange activity and hearing a gunshot at around the time Brinson vanished, but they were unable to provide police with information leading to a suspect. The suspicion that Brinson had been shot was confirmed 3 months later with the discovery of his dismembered remains. Further investigation revealed that he had been involved in a dispute with his roommate, 31-year-old William Irvine. The actual shooting was carried out by Irvine's friend, 23-year-old Blake Quinlan, while a teenager named Leah Atencio helped dismember and dispose of the body. Irvine pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 46 years. He'll become eligible for parole in 2053. And has a mandatory release date of 2065. Quinlan was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life without parole, while Atencio received probation for her role in the crime and ended up serving some prison time for violating the terms of her supervision. She was released in early 2024, much to the disappointment of Brinson's family, who believed she deserved to serve a lengthier punishment for her actions. As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe, and maybe it will be your video that we'll be doing next. Number 2. Vanessa Chaput. A typical jog took a life-threatening turn for 24-year-old Vanessa Chaput in June of 2024 when she came face-to-face with 3 grizzly bears along a paved trail in the Yukon. Her German shepherd Luna instinctively pulled free and chased after the 2 smaller bears. As Chaput cautiously tried to back away from the scene and hide behind a tree, a large male bear charged at her. The gargantuan grizzly chomped his jaws down on the woman's head, causing her barrette to break in his mouth while clawing at her body. Chaput thought about her young daughter, which gave her the determination she needed to survive. A moment of luck came when her barrette snapped inside the bear's mouth, causing him to suddenly release his grip on her head and run away. Just when it seemed like the attack was over, the bear charged towards Chaput a second time as she tried to hide behind a tree. At that exact moment, Luna began barking, once again causing the bear to suddenly change course and run away. Luna was unharmed while Chaput spent 10 days in a hospital. Her arm was broken, she had lost a lot of blood, and she required more than 30 stitches to her head, back, arm, and ear. In a Facebook post about the incident, the Yukon Conservation Officer Services wrote that Luna's barking had triggered a defensive reaction from the bear that attacked Chaput. The post also credited Luna with giving her owner a potentially life-saving opportunity to retreat and call for help. Number 1. Rachel Matusewicz. Rachel Matusewicz was walking her 12-week-old miniature dachshund, Rolo, in Leicestershire, England, in late 2021, when she noticed a man staring at her and smiling in an extremely creepy fashion as he approached with his 2 Labradors. The 36-year-old had just gotten Rolo 4 weeks earlier and was still in the process of getting him vaccinated, so she was carrying him through Bradgate Park in Newton, Linford. During the bizarre encounter, the man greeted Matusewicz and she smiled in response. Once he walked past, she placed Rolo back down on the ground. She then noticed that the man was still staring at her in a seemingly offended fashion. Matusewicz explained that she was only picking up Rolo when he came near her with his dogs because the pup was awaiting his next round of vaccinations, but the man was nevertheless infuriated. He repeatedly said, "You're a bit weird," then told Matusewicz that she was mentally unwell and had mental issues. Disturbed by the stranger's behavior, the woman began walking away with Rolo in her arms. Suddenly, a rock struck her in the head, causing a large head wound that bled profusely into her eye. Matusewicz pulled out her cell phone and began filming the encounter, at which point the man shoved her to the ground with such force that Rolo flew out of her arms and landed on his back. The dog's yelps were so anguished that Matusewicz initially thought he had broken his spine. As she tried to gather her bearings, her assailant snatched her phone from her hand and ran off. Some good Samaritans heard the woman's calls for help and summoned a police officer who drove her home in her car. She took Rolo to the veterinarian, where he received a clean physical bill of health but seemed traumatized by the assault. Matusewicz then went to the hospital where she received treatment for her head wound. Much like Rolo, the incident left her anxious and on edge, but she refused to let a cruel stranger stop her from continuing to live her life. It's unclear whether the attacker was caught. Thanks for watching. Would you rather never feel fear again or never feel pain again, and why? Let us know in the comments section below.